My name's Brian Sanderson. I mean, my granddad started here in 1900. His father was a little bit of a drinker and a smoker. Lived in Kent Green, a village called Kent Green that's down in Scholar Green there. I don't know if you know around there. And he said to my granddad, when you're 21 you haven't smoked or drank, I'll give you quite a bit of money. And I was told it was £100. Well, if it was, that was a fortune. But he reckoned he'd been in the village here and seen this empty building here in 1900 this was, and he decided that he'd like to buy it. A person in Stone owned the building, and he went with some money in his pocket to Stone on a horse and cart at 6 in the morning. They told me he got back at 8 at night, and he bought this, and that's how he started. And he started baking bread. His first few batches he had to throw away because he'd nobody to learn him, or nobody. He was in his family really. His family had got a shop in Kent Green. His father ran a shop in Kent Green, but he learned, he learned the old-fashioned way of baking what they call cottage. I think he started with cottage loaves, what they call the round cottage loaves. And I think he experimented with a lot of different kinds of bread, before he became a good baker, I believe. But as I say about the bread itself, I mean, I was just a child, when the war started. And by this time they'd finished baking, they'd one thing another. Two of his sons died young, and so it was a little bit of a poor time, the 30s, where one died in 1925 and another one died in the early 30s, and from then on I think so many things had gone wrong that he started buying his bread in, still sold bread, and I ran the business till 1980. Still selling bread, but of course it was all bought in bread, obviously. When I was young, when there was bread firms in the potteries that delivered here, there was a firm called Champion, which was Burkett and Roberts, and Mother's Pride, of course, Embry's bread, which they call Sunblessed. Almonds delivered here from Manchester, and there was Roberts's that used to deliver from Biddulph. There was little businesses. We had a little bakery from Tunstall called George Plants, Henry Street in Tunstall they come from. And when they came to the shop, the windows were always steamed up with the bread was still hot, straight from the ovens, and but as I say again, it was so many things I can remember, but it's not relevant really to bread baking. I'll get it right. Not really. He was working in a coal mine at the time, a little futral that was near Kent Green there. I think a lot of them, he was, worked down this futral up until he was 20, and I think he was around 20 or 21 when he moved here. But he just worked. I think his father had got a shop in Kent Green, you see, and he was, I think he always fancied one himself and fancied to start up on his own, which of course he did. Yes, his father was a baker, yes. Yes, his father was a baker. I think that's where he learned quite a bit from his father. But his father then, of course, I think, well, he was, as I say, his father, I think, sort of lost a bit of interest, I think, in it. I don't know. It seemed to be that he just wanted to break and start on his own, really. But his father originally, I think, baked the bread as well in Kent Green, you know. I never even saw one. I think it was in his head, really, you know. He experimented, and once they tell me, I don't know, they tell me they used to queue up. They used to queue up here for the bread. It was so good. This is what elderly people, when I was younger, guys used to stop me and say, oh, you know, Sanderson's bread. Ooh, he says, I wish he was still baking now. It was lovely, this bread was, like the old, you know, it was, you know, they reckoned how good it was. And of course, he must have done something right to build a row of houses and, you know, bungalows, and, you know, he nearly owned the village at one time, I think. You know, he had houses across the road here that are now knocked down. He had houses below as well, so, and the row up here, you know, these were built new in 1932. Well, I took over the delivering of the bread, but of course then it was bought in bread. But they used to deliver all into Mount Pleasant, into Scholar Green, Malcop, Harrishead, on the outskirts of Kidsgrove. They used to come up. They had a same as 4 or 5 mile radius, you know, of bread delivering, you know. As a child going to school at the age of 5, I wasn't allowed to go to school until I'd gone and helped in the shop in the morning and started weighing potatoes in £5 bags. This again, I'm saying £5 bags, the war was still on. I mean, I was 8 when the war ended, but up to then, even before then, I was helping out with potatoes and things that we could get. And then I had to rush off up to the school as a child, you know, at Malcop, and they used to look at my hands, and I used to get a bang behind the side of the head because my hands were dirty in the morning, and I hadn't got time to wash them because I was frightened of being late at school. And the school teachers in them days, I'm afraid, were a little bit more strict than they are today. It was a time when, you know, the snow, we used to seem to have bad snows, bad winters. They had a good, I know my father told me that he started work at 2 o'clock in the morning. That was his start of the day, doing the bread tins, you know, putting the lard or whatever they'd got in the bottom of the bread tins, you know, to stop the bread from sticking, of course, to grease the bread tins every morning. They started with them. And the baking actually started at 2:30 every morning. And he said sometimes he got to bed at 9, 10 o'clock at night. That was before he was married. Because he started baking as soon as he bought the premises, you know, in 1900. So he baked bread for well over 30 years, you see. I should say roughly 34 years he was baking bread. But they were long, hard days, and you know. But of course, the first time they were baking, they delivered up with a horse and cart. We've still got the old stable round the back. And still a thing on the wall of the stable. We could still call it the stable now. And there's a thing on the wall, like an altar, a horse's altar, you know, where they used to connect the time to, I suppose, and keep the horse in there. But I never remembered that, of course. It was all gone when I was born. But there were times when obviously they must have been very hard you know, very hard times. The flour, of course, we'd got a bakehouse round there. The flour was hoisted up on the great big £140 sacks. That's how the flour came. 140 pound sacks of flour. They were hoisted up into the room above the bakehouse, you know, to store the flour. I remember all that. There's things and everything was still there when I was knocking around there. You know, they never took them away. The old hoist and everything was there. And you know, it was, I took over sort of, I had a break. I went in the forces, do national service for 2 years, and from then on I'd worked in the business sort of from leaving school at 15, you know, and the only break I had was to say I went in the forces for 2 years to do national service, and then I came, you know, and started. But everything was bought in, as I say then, you know, it was all bread that was bought in. We had 7 bakeries that used to come here, because I had a big delivery round. I used to leave home at 8 in the morning and get in at 8 at night. I had a 12-hour day just delivering on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then about 6 hours delivering on a Saturday. So they were long days, as I used to do, you know. There was a baker in the Rookery here named Barlow, Mr. Barlow. He used to bake bread. He was still baking. I know this as a fact because he was still baking around about 47, the end of the 40s. He was still baking. He run the post office as well in the Rookery, and it was called Barlow's Stores. I remember he was still baking in 1947 because it's one of the worst winters I ever remember. That was. The snow in this village was 10, 11 foot high, and we weren't baking bread, and we were the only people in the village for a good while with a phone. But I do remember they threw us some sacks, the empty flour sacks that they'd still got round there, and some lads of us, I was 10 at the time, we had to walk through this snow, which as I say was 10 foot high, but people had walked and made a little bit of a pathway. It was as high as the old gas lamps. We had gas lamps in the village then, of course, and the snow was virtually as high as the gas lamps in 1947. There was no snow ploughs or diggers or anything, of course. It was the council men with a spade, you know, shoveling the snow away, and that was it. But I know Mr. Barlow said if you can come down and send people down, send the lads down, I can give you what bread you want. And we carried them up, dragging on the snow in these flour sacks. About eight and 9 loaves in a sack, and about 7 of us went down for this bread. And I think they were cutting up, as people were coming in, I think they were cutting the loaves in 2 to give people bread, you know, because there was nothing moving, of course. There was nothing coming in or going out, of course, or anything, you know. Well, that was 1947. But the gentleman then was still baking, because I remember, of course, clearly being 10 in the 1947 snow. I think it's down on record, that is, as one of the heavy snows we ever had, 1947. So Mr. Barlow was still baking. I think there was a bakehouse at Malcop named Lovett, somebody named Lovett, Joe Lovett I think it was. I think whether he had a small bakery. But to say it's before my time, you know. Well, mostly it was the tin, what they used to call the tin loaves. I think he experimented with the round loaves because I don't think there was tins. I don't think they were made any tins in them days for anything, only the square tin loaf, which was all uncut, of course. There was nothing sliced, of course. and they were all one side. I think they called them the £2 loaves, but I think the actual weight was 1 3/4 pounds, the proper weight of the ordinary white loaf. And they were all, of course, square in the tins. But I think he experimented with what we now know as a cottage loaf, you know, the round ones with the top on.